Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Chris Hernandez-Roy. I'm the Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Americas Program here at CSIS, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this morning. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation organized by CSIS's Project on Prosperity and Development, along with the Americas Program, along with the University of Notre Dame, on the important topic of democracy and the Catholic Church in Nicaragua. I have a few items to announce before we begin this morning. Our discussion will last approximately 90 minutes. We will start with 2 keynote speakers and then move into a panel discussion. Time permitting, we'll open the floor for questions at the end of the panel. And for those of you in the room, if you wish to ask a question, please raise your hand. We'll have a staff member running a microphone. And for our online audience, there's a button on the event website that you can click, which will lead you to a form, and you can ask a question that way. If we do get time for a question, I'll be looking at my phone to read the question, so I'm not distracted by checking my phone. I'm actually paying attention to the questions. The Catholic Church in Nicaragua has deep popular support and has long been an advocate for human rights. As such, it has become, once again, a target of President Daniel Ortega and as his regime further cracks down on dissent and consolidates its dictatorship. President Ortega has taken heavy-handed actions against the Church by arbitrarily arresting members of the clergy, forcing them into exile, or imprisoning several church leaders. It's also seized property, including the highly regarded Jesuit University of Central America in Nicaragua, labeling it a center of terrorism and banning the performance of public religious rites across the country. The government holds Bishop Rolando Álvarez after condemning him to 26 years in prison on trumped-up charges of treason. On Tuesday, just this past Tuesday, the regime published images of Bishop Álvarez in what appeared to be a well-appointed and comfortable jail cell. His gaunt and expressionless looks betrayed the regime's propaganda efforts. Yesterday, the House Committee on Foreign Affairs held a hearing on the issue and demanded the bishop's release. The Catholic Church remains a potent force for social change in the country, given its sizable role in Nicaraguan society, which brings us here today. This event is a continuation of a series of roundtables and events that CSIS has been holding, convened to discuss Nicaragua's fall into dictatorship over the past couple of years. We've assembled a remarkable slate of speakers, bearing great expertise and moral authority to talk about democracy and the Church in Nicaragua. We will first hear prepared and pre-recorded remarks from Reverend John Jenkins, the president of the University of Notre Dame. Father Jenkins is an outspoken critic of the Ortega regime and has written extensively on the rising persecution of Catholic clergy and of the faithful in Nicaragua. The university's Pulte Institute for Global Development has supported efforts to bolster civil society in Nicaragua and Central America at large through the Central American Research Alliance. We are grateful to Father Jenkins and Notre Dame at large, for their contributions to addressing this crisis and their support for this event. Following Father Jenkins' video remarks, Maura Policelli, the Executive Director of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs, will introduce Archbishop Broglio, who will provide keynote remarks, and we will then move into the moderated portion of today's event. Please now turn your attention to the video remarks prepared by Father Jenkins.
Good morning, and my sincere thanks to each of you for taking the time to join us for this important event. I want to extend special thanks to Archbishop Timothy Broglio for offering our keynote address. I also thank Dan Rundy, Christopher Hernandez-Roy, and the teams at the Center for Strategic Studies and the Keough School's DC office for convening today's conversation. For this year's Notre Dame Forum, we are hosting a year-long series of discussions on the future of democracy. Through this ND Forum, we hope to foster respectful and informed dialogue on the rising threats to democracy at home and abroad, and to consider how democracy can be reinvigorated. Research by Notre Dame faculty, graduate students, and their global collaborators at the Varieties of Democracy Project indicates that nearly 75% of the world's population now lives under autocratic regimes, compared to less than 50% in 2012. The situation in Nicaragua is an illustration of the trends. Threats to democracy are joined with limits to freedom of expression, including academic freedom, limits to global dialogue and deliberation, and restrictions on freedom of association and the independent operation of civil society organizations. We have also seen a troubling global decline in freedom of religion for the first time since World War II. Today's conversation will examine the erosion of rights in Nicaragua over the last 6 years. Nicaragua has seen the closing of non-governmental organizations and institutions of higher education. They have also seen numerous Catholic religious orders shut down, their members expelled, and their schools and other social services closed, as well as the unlawful arrest and detention of priests, scholars, and students. As a Catholic university, Notre Dame, through its teaching and research, seeks to advance peace and justice in solidarity with those who are most vulnerable. For nearly a decade now, Notre Dame's Pulte Institute for Global Development, through its Central America Research Alliance, or CARA, has accompanied Nicaraguan scholars and supported their innovative research. CARA partners with nearly 20 institutions throughout the region to promote collaboration among researchers and to strategize about how academic research can inform policy and practice to strengthen democracy and human rights in the region. As higher education institutions, clergy, and scholars have come under attack, Notre Dame has provided spaces for dialogue and hosted regional exchanges on human rights, partnering with the University of Central America in Managua and civil society organizations, many of which have since been closed, as well as working with the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas to advocate for academic freedom. There is much more work to be done in order to protect these freedoms and prevent the further erosion of democracy in Nicaragua and throughout the region. While the challenges to human rights, academic freedom, and religious freedom are especially great at this moment in many places in the world, President Daniel Ortega's attempt to extinguish Catholicism in Nicaragua merits global condemnation on a much larger and louder scale. His regime should be isolated as an international pariah for trying to disappear Catholic institutions, freedom of worship, and freedom of expression. Given these sobering realities, our conversation today could not be more timely, and I thank each of you again for joining us.
I'd now like to invite Maura Policelli, the Executive Director of the University of Notre Dame's Keough School, to the stage to introduce our second speaker, Archbishop Timothy Broglio, President of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Maura has been a critical supporter for this discussion, this broad discussion on Nicaraguan democracy in general, and we once again thank her and Notre Dame for their efforts.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Dean Appleby from the Keough School of Global Affairs, I want to express my deep gratitude for the CSIS team that has been working very hard to pull together today's event, including Dan Rundy, who really was the catalyst for this. I also want to thank my colleague, Laura Mackler, who is here with us. She's the Associate Vice President for Federal and Washington Relations for the University of Notre Dame and has offered tremendous collaboration for today's gathering. In addition to Notre Dame's year-long discussions that Father Jenkins mentioned on the future of democracy, the Keough School recently launched our new strategic plan, and one of the 4 priority research areas is democracy, governance, institutions, and rights. So this is a theme at the university level and at the Keough School that we're very committed to. This work builds on the decades-long expertise of the Keough Institute for International Studies, which, among other things, sponsors champions of democracy from around the world as senior fellows come to campus in South Bend. One of those senior fellows right now is former Nicaraguan presidential candidate Juan Sebastian Chamorro, who is one of our panelists today. Now I have the distinct honor of introducing our esteemed keynote speaker, the Most Reverend Timothy Broglio, currently serving as president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Archbishop Broglio most recently served as a secretary of the conference and as a member of the administrative committee. His past roles with the conference include serving as chairman of the Committee on International Justice and Peace, chairman of the Canonical Affairs and Church Governance Committee, and as a member of the task force for the 2013 Special Assembly and the Committee on Canon Law and Church Governance, Religious Freedom, and International Justice and Peace. Archbishop Broglio was ordained to the priesthood for the Diocese of Cleveland in 1977. He has served in leadership roles throughout the world, including as desk officer for Central America. He was ordained Archbishop by His Holiness St. John Paul II in March 2001, and in November 2007, Archbishop Broglio was named the 4th Archbishop of the Military Services for the U.S. He has been an active and vocal voice for the church in Nicaragua. In 2018, Archbishop Broglio traveled to Nicaragua to express the Catholic Conference's solidarity with the brother bishops in the country. And in his homily at the Cathedral of Managua, he memorably said, "I see the commitment of your bishops as a sign of God's love." At the most recent annual meeting of the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops in Baltimore, just last month, he expressed the conference's solidarity with the persecuted church in places including Nicaragua. Please join me in welcoming Archbishop Broglio.
Thank you. It was kind of Notre Dame to have someone with an Italian surname introduce me. Thank you, and I thank the Center for Strategic and International Studies for the invitation, and especially once again for hosting this event to highlight the dire situation of the church and civil society in Nicaragua. And I'm grateful also for the interest and the participation of Notre Dame University. Last year, I mentioned in this same forum that for me, the plight of the church and the people of Nicaragua is also personal. I served as the Nicaraguan desk officer at the Secretariat of State from 1990 to 2001. Here in the United States, during my tenure as chairman of the Committee on International Justice and Peace, as you have just heard, I visited Nicaragua in 2018 to express the church in the United States' steadfast solidarity with our brothers and in the Nicaraguan episcopate. This year, as you all know, has been especially painful. In February, 222 Nicaraguan political prisoners, virtually the entire political opposition, were exiled to the United States and stripped of their citizenship. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, in collaboration with other civil society organizations, assisted in welcoming these exiles. In February, as you all know, was also the month in which Bishop Rolando Álvarez of Matagalpa was sentenced to 26 years in prison and stripped of his citizenship. As president of the conference, I admitted a statement expressing my profound disappointment at these developments. Fundamentally, They represent a lost opportunity to dialogue and explore avenues of reconciliation that would yield effective civil society initiatives for prosperity for the people of Nicaragua. The Jesuits have been especially hard hit this year. The Order's University of Central America has been confiscated, and the Order's legal status and hence their continuance in Nicaragua is now uncertain. Civil society in the United States is interested in these matters, as the United States is Nicaragua's most important trading partner. For trade, an effective element in the common good, to be sustainable in the long term, however, trading partners must share basic values of political and human rights. Trade represents not just parameters of commercial exchange, but also mutually beneficial societal exchanges that inform the bilateral relations between the trading partners. In this forum last year, I expounded on the Church's social principles, which spring directly from the gospel of Jesus Christ and the deposit of faith and the vivifying power of the sacraments. The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church states, and I quote, "Christian love leads to denunciation, proposals, and a commitment to cultural and social projects. It prompts positive activity that inspires all who sincerely have the good of the human person at heart to make their contribution." Today, I emphasize that these same principles of solidarity and collaboration extend just as powerfully to exploring processes and avenues of dialogue, understanding, and reconciliation. Archbishop Paul Gallagher, the Holy See's Secretary for Relations with States or Foreign Minister, in September expressed the crux of the vocation to political leadership according to the principles of Catholic social doctrine. And I quote, "To serve means to care for those who are fragile in our society, in our peoples. As a part of this shared commitment, rulers must put aside their own needs, expectations, and desires for sovereignty or omnipotence before the concrete gaze of the most fragile." End of the citation. Despite all the pain that the Church has experienced, the hatred expressed through savage attacks against parishes, clergy, confiscations of property, and expulsions from the country, even desecration of the Blessed Sacrament by politically motivated mobs, the Church is committed to dialogue and finding an avenue of reconciliation for the good of the people of Nicaragua. In my February statement, I said that even in this dark hour, courageous hope, charity, and solidarity are bearing witness to the enduring vitality of the faith of the people of Nicaragua and among Catholics worldwide, supporting the Nicaraguan faithful. I join the Holy Father, Pope Francis, in his exhortation to those responsible in Nicaragua that through an open and sincere dialogue, the basis for respectful and peaceful coexistence might still be found. Thank you.
I want to thank once again Father Jenkins and Archbishop Broglio for their insights this morning. We'll now move into the moderated portion of today's or of this morning's event, and I'd like to introduce our panelists. Joining us from that side of the room, not to say right or left, which is a joke from the back, to this side of the room. First is Frederick Davey. He is the Vice Chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Davey has a long history of faith rights advocacy, notably being appointed to the White House Counsel to act as a liaison between federal agencies and faith-based organizations. He is the Senior Strategic Advisor to the President at Union Theological Seminary and is also Senior Advisor for Racial Equality at Interfaith Youth Corps. Seated next to him is Juan Sebastián Chamorro, who was a candidate in Nicaragua's 2021 presidential election, after which he was arrested and imprisoned by the Ortega regime for 20 months. Last February, Juan Sebastián was one of the 222 political prisoners from the country who were freed and put on a plane to be exiled in the United States. He now lives here, having been stripped of his Nicaraguan citizenship. In the middle of the panel, Rosalia Miller is president of the Nicaraguan Freedom Coalition, an educational and advocacy platform which brings together organizations and decision makers to work for freedom, justice, and democracy in Nicaragua. And lastly, but not least, Professor Thomas Hare is a senior researcher and the co-director of the Central American Research Alliance at Notre Dame's Pulte Institute. Dr. Hare develops, implements, and evaluates international development programs, primarily focusing on the rule of law, governance, democracy, and human rights in Central America. I've asked each of the speakers to prepare some framing remarks, and then we'll move into the moderated discussion. Commissioner Davey, please, let's start with you, sir.
Thank you. I want to first say thank you to CSIS for inviting USERF to be a part of this conversation and discussion today. I should just say also, by way of introduction, when you heard my bio read, you'd think, well, why in God's name is he here? And one of the reasons I am here representing USERF, not only because I'm the vice chair there, and I'll say a little bit more about USERF, but because as commissioners, we are given the opportunity to focus in on countries where we want to take a deeper dive, since there are about 28 countries in the USERF portfolio at any one time that we're doing a lot of research on and work on. We're given an opportunity to focus in on a few. And I actually had the opportunity to visit Nicaragua back in in 86. With a group of, then I was Associate Executive Presbyter of the Presbytery of New York, and we put together a group of faith leaders who wanted to support community-based work in Nicaragua, both in the Protestant churches and the Catholic churches there. And so I paid attention to the country over the years, and when I came to USERF, Nicaragua became one of my primary countries to focus on. So that, I would hope, add a little bit of perspective about why I was tapped by USERF to come and give some remarks this morning. As many of you know, USERF is an independent, bipartisan U.S. federal government body that's dedicated to promoting the universal right to freedom of religion or belief around the world. We defend religious freedom internationally for people of all faiths or people of no faith. Throughout the year, USERF uses international standards to monitor freedom of religion or belief and to make policy recommendations to the U.S. government. Nicaragua is a country we monitor and we report on very closely. We remain deeply concerned at President Ortega and Vice President Murillo's brutal crackdown on religious freedom, particularly against the Catholic Church. In just the past year, the Nicaraguan government has exiled, as we've heard, clergymen for peacefully practicing their religion, arbitrarily imprisoned journalist Victor Tique for covering a banned Easter celebration, and sentenced, of course, as we've heard, Bishop Rolando Álvarez to 26 years in prison on spurious charges. The Ortega-Murillo regime also canceled legal status and confiscated property of Catholic educational institutions and charities such as the Jesuit University of Central America and the Sisters Poor of Jesus Christ. Again, all information that we know. To stem this relentless tide of persecution, USCIRF has recommended that the U.S. government impose targeted sanctions on Nicaraguan government officials responsible for religious freedom violations, and we applaud the State Department for having done that. So just a quick word. USCIRF makes recommendations to the State Department, and then the State Department can choose to act on those or not. We recommended sanctions against Nicaraguan government officials, and the State Department has agreed and has implemented those sanctions. Before concluding my remarks, I'd like to inform you all about USCIRF's Frank R. Wolf Freedom of Religion or Belief Victims List. Congress requires USCIRF to maintain the victims list, which contains profiles of certain victims of religious persecution, including those imprisoned due to their faith-based activity or religious freedom advocacy. The victims list is on our website and currently has profiles of 5 imprisoned Nicaraguans, including 2 recently imprisoned former Catholic university students, Ardela Tesero and Gabriel Morales. I encourage all of you to consult the victims list, and if you know of any individuals who have been targeted due to their faith-based activity or advocacy in Nicaragua, we invite you to log on to USCIRF's website and submit information for us to review. Again, thank you all for inviting USCIRF to be here today, and I look forward to the conversation to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Juan Sebastian?
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the opportunity of being here. Thank you. The abuses of the Ortega dictatorship are well documented and have been the source of recent attention in the media. I would like to argue in this opportunity why I think these abuses are occurring. Ortega is against the church, in my opinion, because of the influence of the church among Nicaraguans. Being a political creature, Ortega is obsessed with power. And the church, in his opinion, has power. For Ortega, he confronts the church not from the perspective of the faith, I believe, but as an enemy that competes in power. I reiterate that this is the way that I think Ortega believes about the church. Ortega knows that until 1978, the Sandinistas were a small group of rebels with more setbacks than triumphs. The participation of young students and members of Christian-based communities in working-class neighborhoods in Managua was the power that ignited the insurrection that overthrew Somoza in 1979. The Episcopal Conference saluted the revolution in a pastoral letter of November of 1979, but the support was short-lived. A year later, the bishops warned about the dangers of authoritarian regimes using the church. The Sandinistas responded, quite clumsy in my opinion, by humiliating Monsignor Carballo and disrespecting St. John Paul II in a solemn mass in Managua in April of 1983. The Pope responded by suspending ad divinis 4 priests of the Sandinista government, and more importantly, appointing Archbishop Obando as the first cardinal in Central American history. More powerful and influential, Cardinal Obando's sermons play a crucial role in the elections of 1990, in which Ortega lost to Violeta Chamorro. So Ortega, always the political creature, searching for more power, and knowing that he could not compete with the church, changed the strategy in around the year 2000. He approached the cardinal and asked him to marry him with Rosario in 2005. When Ortega won in 2006, he appointed Obando as head of the Reconciliation Commission, inspired by Desmond Tutu's commission, with the difference that Obando did, unfortunately, very little. The powerful cardinal had become a protocolary figure, appearing every time at the side of Ortega. Protests erupted in 2018, and 2 days after, the police had killed dozens of young students and protesters, and Monsignor Silvio Baez in the Metropolitan Cathedral that had served as a refuge to hundreds of university students and young protesters said, and I quote, "Do not fall into intimidation. Do not let go by violence. Your protest is just, and the church supports you. We not only support you, but we urge you to continue. Your cause is for social justice. Believe in the force of peace and nonviolence." End of the quote. In other words, Ortega had gone back to the 80s with the Catholic Church opposing his repression against the people of Nicaragua, and a new cycle of harassment and persecution started in 2018. So today, in addition of having Monsignor Álvarez condemned to 26 years in prison, we have 84 priests that have been banished or exiled from Nicaragua. 24 of them arrested. 9 of them were at the same time at El Chipote prison with us. The bank accounts of the Catholic Church have been frozen, all charities closed, hookah confiscated, as you have mentioned, and we have Ortega fighting the church because the church is the only obstacle he has to have absolute power. Thank you very much.
Rosalia.
Thank you. Thank you to Daniel Runde, Ryan Berg, and especially you, Chris, and your team. I am pleased and honored to be among such distinguished company. Good morning, buenos dias. I am a member of the Nicaraguan diaspora and live in Washington, D.C. I speak about democracy and the Catholic Church in Nicaragua from the perspective shared by most Nicaraguans who are dispersed, living in Costa Rica and other neighboring countries, the United States, Spain, and other European countries. The Nicaraguan diaspora is strong and actively engaged, working night and day to restore democracy in Nicaragua. The persecution of the Catholic Church, specifically that of Monsignor Rolando Álvarez, as well as evangelical churches, continues to impact the exiled community psychologically, physically, and emotionally. We worry about the people in Nicaragua and about our relatives' well-being. We worry that our activism might harm them, but we don't stop. We go on. I speak to you today still moved by the testimony I heard yesterday at a hearing of the Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs of the United States Congress, where Congressman Chris Smith and Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar demanded that Ortega regime liberate Monsignor Rolando Álvarez now. The purpose of the hearing was to bring greater awareness to his declining health and inhumane prison conditions. Monsignor is experiencing now those conditions. He remains the last cleric in prison by the Ortega Murillo regime. Nicaragua is a Catholic country, so it is understandable that it would bear the brunt of state repression. The frontal attack against the church, understanding, but not accepted. The frontal attack against the church is particularly remarkable, considering that the re-election of Ortega in 2006 depended to a considerable extent on the Catholic Church's support. 667 attacks against the church were committed by the regime since 2018. Last year was disastrous, with 171 attacks. The economic impact caused by these attacks is incalculable. 39 religious, charitable, educational, and pastoral activities carried out daily by the Catholic Church were closed. 214 clerics, including an apostolic nuncio, bishops, priests, nuns, deacons, seminarians, were attacked and threatened with death, defamed, intimidated, and prevented from carrying out their pastoral activity in Nicaragua. 71 graffiti and hate messages were placed in public places. 80 thefts and desecration, such as the burning of the Christ in the cathedral, 82 repressions on lay activities, and 64 prohibitions on procesiones, which is our culture. Our Catholicism is expressed there, and field activities took place, and attacks continue. Unabashedly, on his birthday, this past Monday, the illicit mandatarios showed a video of Monsignor Álvarez being treated to a fake banquet in a room adorned with a bouquet of made in China plastic flowers. Monsignor Álvarez, the most important person in the video, sits there on a chair looking gaunt, not himself. The video was intended to placate the ire of all of us who condemned his imprisonment. But you know, it did the opposite. Le salió el tiro por la culata. It backfired. Because the video increased the fervor, the determination, and the resolve to demand to free Monsignor Báez now. In closing, I plead with the international community to accompany us Nicaraguans in our determination to combat the injustices of this regime and to restore democracy to Nicaragua. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalia, for your very heartfelt remarks.
Thank you.
Professor Hare.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to CSIS for hosting this important conversation together with Notre Dame. As we saw, it's a very important issue to many people and many institutions. And I have, it's a real pro and con to go last here, especially after hearing from the three of you and Juan Sebastián, Rosalia, with your lived experience promoting democracy and freedom in Nicaragua. Really, there is no better representative of the need for action and concerted efforts towards the country than your presence here today. So thank you for that. And I think it is really important to note the bravery that it takes to get up and speak about these issues, knowing what repercussions might happen because of it. And I had the opportunity just a couple of weeks ago to meet with a number of Nicaraguans in exile in Costa Rica, and who really expressed that sentiment of what they were doing in exile, continuing to work as civil society in exile from nearby and those here in DC and other places. The extra effort and the days and nights of work that it takes to keep up that pressure is really admirable. And so I'm really here as an imperfect representative of other voices from our members in the Central America Research Alliance that could not speak publicly, given these the threats of reprisals and the very real pushback that people receive and the threats that they receive when they do speak out or that their families receive. And they can't speak publicly about freedom of religion or freedom of expression more broadly, given those threats and actions. And many of these colleagues worked at the University of Central America, Managua, which is a Catholic Jesuit university, which we heard was closed as a part of this tightening of the screws on the Catholic Church in August of this year. And it was really, as we've heard a little bit of the history, a focal point starting in 2018 of the protests and a refuge for those who wanted to speak out and had some amount of international protection that was afforded to it by the Catholic Church and the Jesuit order over the years. And these colleagues have faced themselves physical threats and intimidations over the past 5 years, whether that's on campus or out conducting their research in the field. So they've lived this same experience, and that's led to their ability to speak out, but in limited ways. It's also resulted in surveys that we've done and work that we've done with Nicaraguans and others in Central America, a real amount of psychological trauma among those human rights defenders and researchers working in the region, and an impact on their careers, maybe least importantly, but also still significant, that they can't publish with their own names. They have to speak anonymously. They have to do things with colleagues in confidence, and that has a real impact, especially, unfortunately, in the academic world, where having your name on things it makes a big difference. So my presence is really an example of the self-censorship that is happening not only in Nicaragua, but increasingly elsewhere in Central America, as we're hearing from colleagues in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras as well, as one of the more subtle ways that freedom of expression is being stripped of individuals. Maybe a more outward expression is through the attacks that we see on the church, but it's also happening in other places. And the message that, in talking with them, my colleagues have asked me to convey, and so my message today is that the threats to democracy are spreading in the whole region and are especially strong where religion and freedom of expression intersect. And that we see most clearly, as we mentioned, coming from the pulpit or from the podium at Catholic and other universities across the region. And this really limits the diversity of ideas or debate, which are seen as threats to power, as Juan Sebastian mentioned, which in the eyes of an authoritarian or a dictator can only be projected by that one single individual or political project. And we're seeing this again in Nicaragua. We're also seeing this rise in other places throughout the region. So it's important, the reaction, not only the reaction for Nicaragua in the case of Nicaragua, but also what the international community does to prevent this contagion from continuing across the region. So I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Professor Hare, and we'll get back to you on spillover effects throughout the Central American region. I'd like to start by asking a question to you, Commissioner. Given what you're seeing, not just in Nicaragua, but what you've seen about religious persecution in other authoritarian regimes sort of worldwide, the places that USCIRF is looking at, and given that it's becoming increasingly dangerous for members of the clergy in Nicaragua to and congregations alike, how can the church, maybe with some examples from other places, how can the church in Nicaragua push back against the regime and its continued oppression, specifically of the church and its institutions?
Sure. First, let me just acknowledge the bravery and the danger. So the bravery of those people who are speaking out, those religious leaders who are speaking out, the persecution that they are enduring for speaking out, and the amount of bravery, the acting out on their faith to be able to do that. USCIRF would be hesitant to offer to religious institutions necessarily ways in which to step into persecution. I think where we would, or step into protests, where we would offer our support as a U.S. federal agency responsible for monitoring and reporting on international religious freedom abroad is to let those countries know that this is a U.S. agency that will advocate on their behalf. So if religious people are speaking out, if they're being persecuted, if being jailed, etc., USCIRF is there to be a voice in ways that they, or perhaps even people in government in those countries, cannot be a voice. We have by mandate, by legislation, the ear of Congress and the White House and the State Department. And we can advocate on behalf of those religious institutions that are seeking to make changes in their government, particularly when those changes are about increasing freedoms, and particularly freedom of religion or belief. So while we can't, by statute, encourage religious institutions or provide a formula or dictate how religious institutions and countries should respond to religious oppression, what we can do is be a voice and a partner for those religious institutions that are responding to these issues, and particularly put pressure on Congress and the White House and the State Department to be supportive of those efforts, but also the larger international community as well. And I think those are the ways that this agency can best support efforts in a country to advance freedoms, and particularly freedom of religion or belief.
So giving a voice to the voiceless, essentially.
Indeed.
And speaking of voice and the influence of people with voice, Juan Sebastian, in a survey from a couple of years ago, 70% of Nicaraguans said that the opinion of religious leaders played an important role in shaping their political views. So given that the church has sustained criticism of Ortega, how have Nicaraguan opposition and civil society actors related or reacted to the latest wave of crackdowns against the church itself?
Well, I would like to point out to something that I forgot to mention, and that is, one of the witnesses yesterday in Congress pointed out of a pastoral letter as early as May 2014, in which the bishops actually had an actual meeting with Ortega and Murillo, and they explained it to them in this pastoral letter, the risks, the socioeconomic and political risk that the country was heading into. So I wanted to bring that to your question in the sense that the prophetic voice of the church cannot be underestimated. They said it from the very beginning. So when protests erupted, Bishop Álvarez and Bishop Baez were there with the people supporting the victims. We have to put this in the context of more than 355 people have been assassinated. 10% of the population of the country have moved out of Nicaragua, and thousands of them have been incarcerated and tortured and injured. So the opposition and civil society, under very complicated circumstances, have reacted the way that we can do given the circumstances. The majority, as you mentioned in your remarks, the majority of the opposition in Nicaragua is in exile. We were put on a plane last February, and there are no opposition voices in Nicaragua, because the moment that you say something, you go to jail, or you wave the national flag, or you do something. So it's extremely complicated situation of extreme repression that we're facing in Nicaragua. So what we have to do is what we're doing today, to bring conscious of the importance of what is happening in Nicaragua, and the importance of the role of think tanks, universities, scholars, of putting all this evidence together, because if you don't build memory into what is happening, these things might be forgotten, and that would be a tragedy. And it will be a tragedy not only for Nicaragua, and I will end up right there saying that dictators, they form kind of a club, and they see what the other dictator is doing. So Ortega is exporting technology that himself imported from Putin's Russia. The laws that put us in jail are a copycat of the laws that Putin made in Russia. So this is not a matter of Nicaragua alone. Religious persecution, violation of human rights have to be denounced, memorized through research, books, articles, events like this, in order to prevent this type of technology to spread out in other countries in Latin America. And I have to say that Central America, I'm extremely concerned of backsliding of democratic values in many of the countries of Central America, and Ortega is playing an important role in this. Finally, I just want to relate to something that it's not related to religious persecution, but that Ortega, aligned with the Iranians and the Russians, is utilizing migration as a weapon against the United States. More than 300,000 people have passed through the Nicaragua International Airport, legal means, airplanes, landing in Managua and being transported to the border of Honduras. Ortega is doing that not for helping people trying to get into the U.S., but as a weapon to attack the United States. And many of these people are coming from Africa, Haiti and Cuba, and this should be pointed out as well as a very serious matter of national security for the U.S.
And they're making a lot of money from it as
I was
well.
a bit saying
Yes,
that,
yes.
Yes. No opposition voices left in Nicaragua. That naturally leads one to think, what is the diaspora doing? Rosalia, you mentioned earlier that Nicaragua is a very Catholic country. What is the reaction of the Nicaraguan diaspora to the ongoing religious persecution in the country? How have religious authorities been engaging with the diaspora on these issues?
Yes, an excellent question, and one that I'm glad to expand, to elaborate. You know, every day in the WhatsApp chats and the social media, we get, every morning when we wake up, there's some news, some horrible news that something happened to someone that we know in Nicaragua. Or maybe we don't know them, but they're our people too. And so how do we react? At first it's shock, then it's outrage, and then we think, okay, so what are we going to do about it? And luckily, fortunately, we have some structure, some very good groups, opposition groups, diaspora groups, who discuss among ourselves and support each other and find ways that we can process these attacks against Nicaraguans who are, of course, in the country. Another thing that is interesting to learn, is good to learn, is that when this happens in Nicaragua, or rather when the Ortega Murillo government sees, learns, hears any exposition, any talk that we are all involved in, and others in the diaspora, it's almost automatic. They go to the family's home and post guards or go in the motorcycles around asediando those families. And we know people that work with us who have had to become incognito, anonymous, because their family members are suffering for their actions abroad. So that's the diaspora. And how have the religious authorities been engaging with this? Well, we have Monsignor Silvio Baez in Miami, who preaches every Sunday as an Agathis church. And he is our soul, our heart, of those of us who are outside of Nicaragua, who cannot go back to our country. And he gives us hope. So that's a good representation of the kind of religious support that we get, members of the diaspora.
And you mentioned every morning there's new news. I know that this morning there was news of a well-known professor in Nicaragua who was arrested, and his university had been closed in 2018,
exactly.
and was finally arrested.
Yeah. Every day there's something.
Yeah.
For publishing something on Twitter.
On
Yeah.
Twitter.
I just wanted to mention that when I said physical reactions that we get, psychological and emotional, I meant every word of it.
Yeah.
Physical, there are people suffering from blood pressure issues because of that uncertainty, that anxiety that is occurring within the diaspora. Thank you, sorry.
Yeah, no, of course. Professor Hare, freedom of religion is just one of a long list of freedoms that should be guaranteed by the state of Nicaragua, which it is not doing. What are the implications of Ortega's persecution of the church for other freedoms? You had mentioned a minute ago freedom of expression, for instance, for other freedoms in Nicaragua.
Yeah, and hearing Juan Sebastian and Rosalia, it made me think that I'm going to take a leap here, and I'm going to reference Miss Universe in a discussion about freedom of religion.
Yeah.
But I think as we wake up to new news all the time, the recent naming of Miss Nicaragua as Miss Universe in the pageant in El Salvador, and rose her prominence, her profile, and things like that, such that people were able to go back on Twitter or Facebook and see that she participated in the events of 2018, protesting the regime and the crackdown on Social Security at that time, which then put her in the crosshairs of the regime, who should have been celebrating this wonderful achievement on an international scale. But instead, after some back and forth, as I understand it, decided to also not allow her to come back to Nicaragua. Her parents have been exiled now. and those repercussions continue to happen. And I think that case is emblematic, unfortunately, of what happens to many people who don't make the news, right? And it shows what Juan Sebastian was mentioning before about any perceived threat to absolute power, whether that comes from the church, whether that comes from civil society, whether that comes from Miss Universe, who then has a little bit more of a higher profile, that is going to be shut down by the regime. And that's where freedom of expression and other freedoms come into play, because it's not that, as we heard, Ortega himself was raised Catholic and engaged with the church over years in different ways. And so it's not that he opposes the faith because of the faith, it's because of the power that it has and the social message and the civic space that the church holds in Nicaragua and throughout the region. And I think, what he's really working at is limiting, and limiting is not even a strong enough word, he's trying to obliterate any kind of civic space and voice that might oppose him. And that really happens through limiting freedom of expression, again, whether it comes from the church, whether it comes in a classroom, or whether it happens through more traditional targets such as through journalism and the media. And I think, speaking of the dictator's playbook, the first step really is limiting the media and things like that. Then it comes to limiting church and civil society more generally. Then it may come to limiting the role of academics and others who you don't traditionally think of as civil society actors, but who have targets on their back because of a tweet that they maybe made. And all of this is important because things like academic freedom play a role in an open society to stimulate dialogue and debate. And if that goes against or doesn't align perfectly with the desires of the omnipotent force of a dictator, then it's not going to be allowed.
Mm-hmm. I fear for what that will mean for Nicaraguans who have to represent their country in some way, shape, or form, who aren't necessarily overtly trying to be political. For instance, we have the Olympics coming up. What's going to happen with Nicaraguan athletes who suddenly say, wait a minute, what's going on in my country is not right? Are they going to put all those people in jail as well, too? Commissioner Davey, to what extent is USURF seeing similar patterns of persecution in other countries that you're looking at? And I'm thinking of nearby countries. You know what I'm going to ask you. Mm-hmm. It's been mentioned today, Cuba. Yeah. We know that there's religious persecution in Cuba. Cuba is a very close ally of Nicaragua. To quote a former U.S. official, as part of the troika of tyranny. What are you seeing in Cuba, and how is that similar to what's going on, or different, in Nicaragua?
Sure. Well, in many ways it's very similar. So USURF recommended that the State Department designate Cuba also as a country of particular concern, which is sort of the worst designation, if you will, we can give a country when it comes to religious freedom. Just to cite some specific examples, the Cuban government arrested Laredo Hernandez Garcia and his wife, Donata Perez Pacero, who are leaders of the Santeria community, and they're unaffiliated with the Cuban regime, and they remain in prison for their peaceful participation in the July 11, 2021 protests. There's a leading pastor in Cuba of the Monte de Sion Independent Church, Lorenzo Fajardo, who has been in prison for his participation in those same protests. And then throughout 2023, the Cuban authorities have prevented the Ladies in White, which is an organization of relatives of dissidents who've been in prison, from attending religious services on Sunday. And they do this, the government does this through surveillance and violent arrest, including arrest of these ladies in white who've attempted to go to church in the last couple of weeks. So we see a lot of similarities between the Nicaraguan government and Cuba. I think that what has been observed about the exportation of oppressive measures is part of what's happening in Central and South America and in Cuba. We see it around the world. We see it in Asia and Southeast Asia. We worked hard, for example, to get the Vietnamese government not to follow the role that China has taken when it comes to issues of religious freedom and religious oppression. We see it in East Africa. We see it in Sub-Saharan. We see it in the Sahel. The same kind of exportation of oppressive measures to retard freedom of religion or belief, and we're definitely seeing it in this region and in Cuba in particular. Again, a bit personal to me. I went to Cuba 2009. I rented a car. I think the Koreans had some kind of car rental deal with the Cubans at the time. I put 1,500 miles on that car so that I could know more about the country. Was surveilled, probably the entire time I was there. Didn't matter. That's part of the experience. And it's difficult to see the lack of progress, and it's difficult to watch things go the other way. So, but it is the similarities are there. And it's the job, again, of this agency to call them out and to insist that this government, the U.S. government and its component parts, use every legal means it has to insist that the country enhance freedom of religion or belief for its citizens and stop its oppressive measures, and will continue to do that, and particularly in this area, and particularly in Cuba.
Yeah. You mentioned the Damas de Blanco, the ladies in white, who on Monday, after having gone to church, as you said, 20 of them were arrested, arbitrarily detained. Many of them have gone through that multiple times. And they arrested, among the arrested was Berta Soler, of course, the leader of Damas de Blanco, and her husband. And this comes 2 weeks after Cuba was evaluated in the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council. So, Juan Sebastián, as we've mentioned earlier, the regime recently released 12 imprisoned priests, sending them to Rome in a move that mirrored last February's release of the 222 prisoners, of which you were one. What do you think of this recent release of the priests sent to Rome? And is it merely an effort to save face by the regime, or does it indicate some sort of progress between Rome and Nicaragua?
I don't see any progress at all. I see a pattern of telling people that if you speak out, no matter if you are a pastor or a priest, even if you preach, and you preach for the freedom of Rolando Álvarez, you go to jail. And after going to jail, you're going to be expelled from the country. And related to the previous question, this is what the Cubans are exporting, by the way, because they have learned throughout the years that a very convenient way of reducing the voice of opposition leaders is to take them out. And we are facing it right now with the case of Nicaragua. I mean, the purpose of sending the majority of the opposition of Nicaragua out of the country was precisely not to be there in the country and denouncing the abuses, which brings to the concern of what the role of the international community should be, respecting human rights. Obviously, the international community is designed to promote communication, dialogue among nations that are willing to listen and understand what's going on. But this is not the case of Nicaragua. So in the context of a repressive regime, you have to speak out. And, you know, I can say that one of the very powerful reasons why I'm here sitting, talking to you, banished from Nicaragua, without my nationality, but at least free from the cell, is the campaign that my wife and other wives from political prisoners did throughout the international community, speaking out of the importance of the international community to know what's going on with the violation of human rights, and not only knowing but taking action. And this pressure actually leads to something in the liberation of our case. But in a larger extent, I'm sure that the international community can play an important role in promoting solutions to the problem. We're seeing in Venezuela. I'm a little bit doubtful about the negotiation process in Venezuela as we speak, but there is a negotiation process, at least. I don't know how honest the Venezuelan government is going to be, but at least the pressure at a very high cost, I should add, at least has forced the regime of Maduro to actually sit at a table, sign an agreement, and, well, if they comply, that's another matter. But the fact that they had the opportunity, the opposition, I mean, to at least sit the regime at the table is something that, unfortunately, in the case of Nicaragua, we're not having, and I don't see a negotiation in the near future.
That is a good segue to the question I want to ask Rosalia, but the Venezuelans made some progress, entre comillas, yesterday, given that yesterday was the deadline for the administration to consider snapping back sanctions on Venezuela, so they moved forward, perhaps, we'll see. That clearly is evidence of the importance in Maduro's mind of sanctions and the cost to the Venezuelan economy. Despite Ortega's staged cell videos, Rosalia, with the plastic flowers from China that you mentioned, conditions for the bishop appear to have deteriorated. How should the international community mobilize to secure his release beyond calling attention to his plight? Is there a need for more sanctions? USURF has provided recommendations to the State Department, which has implemented certain sanctions. Are they enough? Should there be more targeted sanctions, bearing in mind the need to avoid the impact of sanctions on the average Nicaraguan citizen who's already suffering? We don't want to make that plight worse.
Yes, I love to talk about these topics because, first of all, we're all working together. People here, people who are listening, we're all working together. And that means the United States Department of State, even the OAS. I say even because Nicaragua has divorced itself from the OAS, as we know, although that's, by the way, not totally so, because there are acuerdos there that have to be honored. But we're all in this together. And so what needs to be done is actions. But we do have actions now, you might say, but it's just not enough. I think that Monsignor Álvarez is showing us his determination. He's the pebble in Ortega Murillo's shoes. And his stand is actually, so I'll answer it both ways. His stand is actually a victory. And in fact, I wrote this down, that his cruel treatment is a demonstration of the cowardice of his captors. It's sort of turning things around and allowing us who are outside the country looking into this jail, which is now the country's become a prison. He is inspiring us by his behavior, by his tolerance, by his good example of how to behave in his situation. How can the international community do more? Well, I think that we need to engage the social society, members of social society, exiled Nicaraguans, and come together, perhaps in a roundtable discussion, and have an ongoing conversation about specific actions to take. And that, just to finish about the sanctions, education needs to happen about sanctions, because Ortega uses the sanctions to intimidate, to give the false impression to the pueblo de Nicaragua that sanctions are harming them. In fact, it's not that way. And that needs to be clarified, because because it's actually preventing, it's a vicious circle. Targeted sanctions are what needs to happen. Targeted sanctions need to be done to the inner circle, the círculo de acero, decimos, of his inner circle. And that is going on, but we need to do more. We have the Renacer Act that needs teeth. It's there, but it needs, I say colmillos, it needs a lot more to become, to make a difference. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things that can be done and that are being done, but we need to do more. And the international community needs to listen to that and listen to us. And thank you, CSIS, for having us here today, because this is the sort of thing that creates pressure. And just to conclude on that answer, the 222 that came on February 9th, it just didn't happen on its own. The pressure, and Juan Sebastian mentioned his wife, Vicky, we were all in the streets here in Washington, in Los Angeles, in Miami, you name it. Europe. There were groups of us in Europe, exactly. In Costa Rica, we were all demonstrating, exercising the voices being the voices of the voiceless. And we think that all of this together, I certainly believe that, has helped to get this resolved. And I think the same will happen with Monsignor Álvarez, and it should, and it will.
Thank you. Professor Hare, turning back to your very initial remarks, where we said we would maybe talk about some of the spillover effects. Are you seeing the attacks against the church in Nicaragua embolden attacks against the church or affiliated institutions in other neighboring countries in Central America? Or is it more enabling attacks on other rights, or both?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, we are seeing that. And I actually hate to go into this topic after Rosalia's positive and hopeful summary there, because I do want to add some positivity to this, or some path forward. But I think taking a step back and looking across the region, there's not a lot of reason to have that hope, because there is a lot of contagion that's happening, coming from Cuba, coming from other places, but especially Nicaragua, to the countries of the so-called Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. I think the most, and forgive me for being from a university and speaking about universities, but it's the world that I know best. Minutes after the closure of the decree came down closing the UCA in Managua, colleagues at the University of Central America in El Salvador started receiving WhatsApps, tweets, and other threats from people in power in El Salvador saying, we're coming for you next. Mm-hmm. And I think you don't need to know much else than that they're looking for specific actions that can be taken to try to silence anybody who might speak out. And it hasn't worked, and as in the case of the five years plus of pressure that was applied to the UCA in Managua, the rector of the University of Central America in San Salvador has become more and more vocal, especially as the elections of next year start to approach, about the re-election, which is forbid by the Constitution of the current president of El Salvador. And so I think, and that's, and then the administration is pushing back in more subtle ways of stripping certain rights and privileges from the university, also of the rector, some of the honorary titles that he's received from the government over the years actually being rescinded. Petty things, but over time they really add up and start to feel more oppressive to people who might then, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, start to self-censor a little bit more. And that's what, I going back again to the bravery that it takes to speak out, we can't let that happen, because that's where we start to lose those who have their voice and are speaking out. But then it becomes more incumbent upon us to be that voice for the voiceless going forward. And I think, again, not to end my comments here, hopefully there'll be some positive questions, but I think taking a view from 30,000 feet, we're seeing the greatest threat to democracy in the region since the murder of the Jesuits in 1989 on the campus of the University of Central America in San Salvador. What's happening now isn't as blatant as that. It's not as open as that in many cases. In some cases it is. But this democratic backsliding is real, and what is happening in the region, I think we've seen that transition, the 30-year transition to democracy for most of the countries of Central America, these were incomplete transitions, institutions that have not completely formed themselves, over 30 years for a variety of reasons and understandable reasons of it takes time to build a strong and healthy democracy. And we've seen here in this country the threats to democracy that can happen after even more time. And so I think those institutions being politicized and taken apart from the inside really show the desire for the leadership of certain countries, Guatemala and El Salvador most specifically, to start to follow the path that Ortega took. And it's something that we need to keep in the limelight.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that the authorities in the university in El Salvador are taking threats very seriously with a country that has been under a permanent state of emergency for the last 2 years with 70,000 alleged gang members, many of them probably are, but alleged gang members imprisoned. You can't imprison your way out of a problem with attacks against the freedom of the press in El Salvador. I'm sure they're taking those threats very seriously, and we're seeing this in attacks in Guatemala, you mentioned, with the prosecutor going after the president-elect and his political party. In Honduras, we've now just had, a few weeks ago, the appointment of a prosecutor, a chief prosecutor, under some very dubious and downright strange constitutional maneuvers to get around the power of Congress. So really, we are in a very, very difficult period in Central America in terms of democratic backsliding. On that very happy note, I note that we have a few minutes left. I'd like to give an opportunity for our in-public audience to ask a question if they'd like to, and extend that invitation also to our online audience. If somebody in the room has a question or a comment, Tom will provide you with a microphone. We'll start over here. Tom? I'm not sure what he's pointing at.
We have an audience question from the Washington Post that I was going to read real quick.
All right, let's start with that, and then we have these two gentlemen and Mark Schneider in the back.
Thank you all again for sharing your time and insights with us. This question comes from Mary Beth Sheridan at the Washington Post. To what extent is daily Catholic practice being repressed? Can priests celebrate Mass? Can Catholics attend Mass? Are Catholic schools still functioning other than the Jesuit University? Thank you.
I can answer some of that. May I? And then you can
Go ahead,
me.
go ahead.
Priests are celebrating Mass, but here's the twist. You can almost 100% be sure, almost, that there is someone planted there who is a spy in every Mass, watching to see who is there, what is being said, and sometimes even some of those attendees, congresionistas, who are questioned outside the church to find out exactly what the priest said and to corroborate whether they're telling the truth or not. So that maybe you would like to add to that.
I only would add that this is not only happening to priests, that if a priest goes out of the country for a pastoral trip, almost for sure he will not be allowed to get in back, which creates a huge, violation of right. You're denying of entering into your own country. But this is happening also to civilians, and families have been separated. So I will add that particular form of repression, particularly against priests.
I might just add, looking at the education system overall, that I correct my numbers if I'm wrong, but it's not just the UCA. It was before that 27 other universities that were shuttered before then, the Incaye Business School that was closed after. And plus, with the closing of thousands of NGOs that supported the education system in some way, shape, or form, those supports are no longer there. And so even if schools aren't closed themselves, a lot of the extracurriculars, even some of the curricula itself, is no longer available. School feeding programs are no longer operating. So it has a whole quieting effect on across the board, whether or not a school is closed.
And also, if I may add, those schools, the K-12 schools, the business aspect of the schools, they're being questioned and asked to produce documents to see if they pay taxes and so on. And of course, you know where that's leading to, because eventually they will be charged as not paying the taxes, and therefore the rest follows, the closing.
So this is having an effect not only on the people that are living today and suffering the regime today, but this is a direct impingement on Nicaragua's youth and its future.
It's a huge cost on human capital.
Yep.
Yeah. We have a question over here, Tom, or Henry.
Hi, my name is J.P. Carroll. I'm a senior fellow with the Joseph Rainey Center for Public Policy. Muchísimas gracias por su discurso esta mañana. Un honor estar aquí con ustedes. I wanted to ask, it seems that one of the main unspoken factors in what's happening in Nicaragua is the deepening relationship with China having been restored in 2021 and the free trade agreement having been signed over the summer. In short, what impact, and this could also be, well, a question for everyone, but also Commissioner's perspective with the sanctions, what perspective, what impact are U.S. sanctions really having economically, given that anything that changes from that standpoint, China can easily replace, resupply, if you will, as an important economic partner. So in light of the recent meeting between President Biden and President Xi at APEC, what role, if any, is there for China to perhaps be an intermediary to improve what is happening in Nicaragua? What sense do you get of that? Thank you.
Well, the economic impact of the free trade agreement of Nicaragua with China will have a very limited effect. China is too far. It's surrounded by countries that provide products like Nicaraguan products, coffee, sugar, meat, Vietnam, Indonesia, so on. So we don't have a competitive advantage in exporting to China. We did have a free trade agreement with Taiwan, which was canceled by Ortega. That was providing some benefits to the Nicaraguan economy. However, because of the same reason that I'm talking about, it never went to be like a very large free trade agreement as compared to the U.S. There's no way you can compare CAFTA with any other agreement. There's no substitute. You won't be able to substitute China with CAFTA. Just to give you an example, before CAFTA, in 2006, exports were about $2 billion. Now there's about $7 billion. So, so I don't see that as a big impact. There are probably going to be some companies owned by the Sandinistas importing stuff from China and avoiding competition in the markets and making money in the process. That's probably going to be the case. But in terms of the general population, I don't think so. Now, the sanctions in Nicaragua so far has been targeted to individuals. And there has been, and there are two ways, direct sanctions on economic assets, freezing assets, and so on, or reverting visas to perpetrators. But still the numbers are very limited. Just to give you an example, in Europe, there's only 21 people sanctioned. And Ortega has not been sanctioned himself. His wife has. But I think, so far the sanctions as targeted to individuals have not had any impact on the economy as a whole.
There was a question, yes.
Hello, good morning. My name is Juan Lorenzo Holman. I am the CEO of La Prensa in Nicaragua. Also a political prisoner, 545 days, share with one that experience. I wanted to add something, some numbers to this conversation, and is that as August this year, there were 58 priests that are in exile. Those 53 in August have reached to 92 as today. So at the end of the year, I'm thinking that we're going to have over 100. Among those 91, are 5 bishops. And then we have to add some seminars and deacons that are 8 more, and 83 nuns. Now the Jesuits have been banned from Nicaragua. The Franciscans school in Matagalpa was recently closed. So we are going to see more and more attacks on the church in the coming days and months, because, like one said, they feel that the Catholic Church is a threat, because the priests stand up and when they do their homily, they speak what the people are feeling. They speak out. Well, they used to speak out, because, like Rosalia said, in every mass there is somebody looking after what the church, what the priest is going to say, and immediately after he is either sick and grab to putting him in jail, or they threaten him and they shut them down. That's why they leave. Now, the pursuit to Christians is not only to Catholic Church. Yeah. Also, the Protestant Church is being persecuted. 21 pastors are in exile right now. So it's persecution. So the only 2 institutions, may I say, that are speaking out what the Nicaraguans are feeling and going through right now is the church, not the Episcopal, not the Conferencia Episcopal, the church, and the journalists. And as today, only the journalists are the only ones who stand up and speak for those who doesn't have a voice. Now, there is no independent media in Nicaragua. All independent media is working from exile. We have over 150 journalists in exile right now. But those 150 are putting words, and are putting are telling the stories of what Nicaragua is going through inside. Are fighting the auto-censorship. And the auto-censorship is not people auto-censor in the sense of they are not going to talk in public, but they go and talk through journalism and through the priests, through the church. So what can be done? They said, you talked about things that have to be done. Well, the other things that can be done is support freedom of expression and freedom of press through helping independent media to keep doing what the job they're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, I think, I think Rosalia would like to make a comment on that.
One more thing.
I'd like to just keep it very brief, because I know Commissioner Davey has another commitment. If we could keep that very brief, and the Commissioner may have to leave, I would like to allow Mark Schneider to ask his question as well. If you have to leave, sir, go ahead, Rosalia.
Extremely brief. To Juan Lorenzo's point, which I had hoped to mention, that on 20, and I have more, but will be very brief. On 24 occasions, evangelical pastors and families and faithful have been harassed and repressed by police and paramilitaries. Some have been persecuted, exiled, and prevented from entering the country. There are more to it, but to your point, Juan Lorenzo, I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
And we'll end with a question from Mark Schneider, please.
Thank you. I want to thank all of the panelists for their comments. I guess my real question is, given the disastrous situation that we find ourselves in, Nicaragua finds itself, looking at other instances where we've had to deal with authoritarian or dictatorial governments, what is it that is, and I'll be very frank, what is it the United States government is not doing now that you think it should in terms of not tomorrow, but over the course of the next several years, helping you to bring about a change in the situation and a restoration of constitutional government and democracy in Nicaragua?
Thank you. I would just start by saying that the problem that we're facing have to be resolved by the Nicaraguans, and the opposition of Nicaragua has a very important role in maintaining this lead of fight for democracy with the support of the international community, not the other way around, international community solving our own problems. Right. So with that introduction, I should add also that there are hundreds of perpetrators that are still at large that can be sanctioned, and I think the U.S. can do that. Usually sanctions are being criticized but they have an overall effect on innocent people, and there is some truth in this argument. However, there are different families of sanctions. There are targeted sanctions to individuals, to organizations, to businesses that allow the regimes to get resources, and those have not been tried. So I'm not talking necessarily about trade sanctions, but sanctions against perpetrators for sure, and some of the organizations that are helping these perpetrators of violators of human rights, violators of crimes against humanity, to be sanctioned by the international community, and the U.S. has taken a role, but I think they have to move forward. There has not been a sanction since last year, August 2022, so I think the U.S. should move forward and not be shy about this kind of policies. As long as they don't affect the entire population, there are options that can be taken.
We're going to have to leave it there, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me in giving a warm welcome and a thank you to, not a warm welcome, a warm thank you to Commissioner Davey, Juan Sebastián Chamorro, Rosalia Miller, and Professor Hare for their comments today.
Thank you.